In this chapter, we'll be examining the spinal cord, spinal nerves, and somatic reflexes. We'll begin by looking closely at the spinal cord, as well as the spinal nerves. And then we'll look into how some of these somatic reflexes relay their information. Every year in the United States, thousands of people become paralyzed by spinal cord injuries that result from automobile or motorcycle accidents, contact sports, or falls. Although the spinal cord is protected by the vertebral column, damage can occur as a result of fracture of the vertebral column or from viral infections. The spinal cord serves as a pathway between the brain and the rest of the body, so damage to it can cause some devastating effects. Paraplegia is the paralysis of lower limbs, and quadriplegia results from higher damage in the spinal cord. It's paralysis of all four limbs. This can often involve respiratory paralysis, loss of sensation, or motor control. Disorders of the bladder, bowel, and sexual function, depending on which level the spinal cord is damaged at. Sometimes we can see hemiplegia, which is paralysis of one side of the body. This most often results from strokes, but can also be due to other brain injuries and occasionally some spinal cord injury. Information moves up and down the spinal cord in very specific patterns. So damage to one side of the spinal cord will cause a certain type of disorder. Damage to another region could cause a completely different situation. The spinal cord serves in three principal functions: conduction, locomotion, and in reflexes. Bundles of fibers pass information up and down the spinal cord. They connect different levels of the trunk with each other and to the brain. Locomotion involves walking and repetitive coordinated actions of many different muscle groups. There are central pattern generators that are pools of neurons that provide control over flexions and extensions and allow the alternating movement of our limbs in order to coordinate the pattern of walking or running or swimming. And the third component are reflexes. These are involuntary, stereotyped responses to stimuli, like withdrawal of a hand from a hot stove, or the patellar tendon reflex, where the doctor hits you with a little mallet in the patellar tendon and your knee will jerk. These reflexes involve the brain sometimes, and the spinal cord, and peripheral nerves. Not always does the information get sent up to the brain before a response is elicited, but eventually the brain will get that information. The spinal cord is a cylinder of nervous tissue that arises from the brainstem at the foramen magnum of the skull. It passes through the vertebral canal right behind the vertebral body. The spinal cord ends at L1, or maybe a little bit beyond. It's about 1.8 centimeters thick and about 45 centimeters long. It occupies the upper 2/3 of the vertebral canal. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. The first pair passes between the skull and C1, and the rest pass through the intervertebral foramina all the way down the spinal cord. Our body, thus, is divided into various segments. Each segment is supplied by a pair of spinal nerves, one on the left and one on the right. Along the spinal cord, there are longitudinal grooves, one on the anterior side and one on the posterior side. They're called the anterior median fissure and the posterior median sulcus. The cord is divided into cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral regions. There are two enlargements, one in the cervical area and one in the lumbar area. The cervical enlargement supplies nerves to the pectoral girdle, whereas the lumbar enlargement supplies all the nerves of the pelvic girdle. After the spinal cord ends at the medullary cone, or conus medullaris, around L1, it turns into sort of a horse's tail arrangement, many different fibers, ending down in the sacral area. This arrangement is called the cauda equina, and it ranges from L2 down to the sacral level 5. The spinal cord and the brain are wrapped in 3 fibrous connective tissue membranes called the meninges, or singular is meninx. They separate the soft tissue of the central nervous system from the bones of the cranium and the vertebral canal. From superficial to deep, they're called the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. The dura mater forms a loose-fitting sleeve around the spinal cord, or a dural sheath. This dural sheath is about the thickness of a rubber glove. It's made of tough, collagenous membrane that's surrounded by the epidural space, so the space above the dura mater. This space is filled with fat, plenty of blood vessels, and loose connective tissues. Sometimes anesthesia is delivered in this epidural space during childbirth or some surgeries. It's called epidural anesthesia, and it makes its way into the blood vessels and blocks the pain signals that are ascending the spinal cord. The arachnoid mater is a membrane made of simple squamous epithelium. It lines the dura mater and forms a loose mesh of collagenous and elastic fibers that span the gap between the arachnoid membrane and the pia mater below. The space here that is traversed by these elastic fibers is called the subarachnoid space. It's a gap between the arachnoid membrane and the pia mater. This subarachnoid space, in blue here, is filled with cerebral spinal fluid. We'll talk about that in future chapters in more detail. The subarachnoid space continues inferiorly beyond the medullary cone and contains the cauda equina and the CSF that bathes it. When it reaches this level, it's called the lumbar cistern. The third layer, right on the surface of the spinal cord and brain, is the pia mater. It's a delicate, translucent membrane. It follows precisely the contours of the spinal cord and the brain. The filium terminal, or the terminal filium, is a fibrous strand of pia mater that extends beyond the medullary cone within the lumbar cistern amongst the fibers of the cauda equina. It fuses with the dura mater and forms the coccygeal ligament, which anchors the spinal cord to coxal vertebrae 1. Denticulate ligaments extend through the arachnoid space into the dura mater and anchors the spinal cord, thus limiting its side-to-side movement. When we examine the cross-sectional anatomy of the spinal cord, we'll see a central area of gray matter that's sort of in the shape of a butterfly, and it's surrounded by white matter. The gray matter is where we see the neuron cell bodies. There's very little myelin, and thus they appear gray. This is where most of the information is processed, and a lot of synaptic integration occurs, right here in the central gray matter. The white matter is abundantly myelinated, hence its white color. It carries signals from one part of the central nervous system to the other. When we look more closely at the gray matter in the spinal cord, it looks like a butterfly or H shape in cross-section. There are a pair of posterior or dorsal horns. This is where sensory information enters the spinal cord. In the posterior root of the spinal nerve, here we'll see only sensory fibers and a posterior root or dorsal root ganglion. There's a pair of thicker anterior or ventral horns. The ventral horns are larger because they contain the somas or cell bodies of all of the motor neurons, and the ventral root or anterior root carries these motor fibers out into the spinal nerves. The gray commissure is the region that connects the left and right sides of the spinal cord. It's punctuated by the central canal, and in young people that's lined with ependymal cells and filled with cerebral spinal fluid. You'll also notice a small lateral horn on the side of the butterfly. This is only visible from thoracic vertebrae 2 through lumbar vertebrae 1. This contains neurons of the sympathetic nervous system. Again, we'll address that in a future chapter. As we look more closely at the white matter, we'll see that it surrounds the gray matter completely. Again, we have these bundles of axons that course up and down the spinal cord, providing avenues of communication between the various levels of the central nervous system. They ascend or descend in columns or funiculi. There are 3 pairs of these white matter bundles, and each can contain both ascending and descending tracts or fasciculi. There are 3 pairs of these white matter bundles called columns or funiculi. On the dorsal side or the posterior side, we see the posterior columns or funiculi, a pair. And then on the sides, we see a pair of lateral funiculi, and then a pair of anterior funiculi in this region. Again, each of them contains many subdivisions, which we'll take a look into soon. They are called tracts or fasciculi. You can see that some of these tracts ascend and some of the tracts descend the length of the spinal column. These ascending and descending tracts carry information up and down the spinal cord. The ascending tracts carry sensory information up, and the descending tracts carry motor information down. All the nerve fibers in a given tract have a similar origin, destination, and function. Most of the fibers will decussate, that is, cross over to the other side of the spinal cord on their way up or down the brainstem and spinal cord. The fibers are said to move in a contralateral direction when the origin and destination of the tract are on opposite sides of the body. Some fibers, though, will maintain an ipsilateral pathway. That is, the origin and destination of the tract are on the same side of the body. They do not decussate or cross over to the other side. Now, ascending tracts, again, carry sensory signals up the spinal cord. The sensory signals travel across 3 neurons from the origin in the receptors to the destination in the sensory areas of the brain. We'll look at several different ascending tracts. Again, there are 3 sequential neurons in the ascending tracts. The first-order neurons will detect the stimulus and transmit the signal to the spinal cord or the brainstem here. The second-order neurons continue up through the spinal cord to the thalamus at the upper end of the brainstem. Now, in this diagram, we've got the spinal cord here, and then this is the medulla and the midbrain and the cerebrum. The third-order neuron then carries the signal the rest of the way to the sensory region of the cerebral cortex. So here, the neuron synapses in the thalamus and continues on to the cortex for higher levels of processing. So again, 3 neurons. The first-order neuron detecting the stimulus and carrying the information into the spinal cord. The second-order neuron then continues up into the thalamus. And then the third-order neuron will carry the signal from the thalamus to the cortex. So each of the ascending tracts that we explore here will have these same 3 neurons bringing information in from the periphery up to the brain. The major ascending tracts that we'll take a brief look at are the Gracile Fasciculus, the Cuneate Fasciculus, the Spinothalamic Tract, the Spinoreticular Tract, and the posterior and anterior Spinocerebellar Tracts. Now, I may cover quite a bit of information here. However, you really need to just keep in mind these 3 different levels of neurons that are bringing ascending information, that is sensory information, into the brain for processing. Let's begin by looking at the Gracile Fasciculus. This fasciculus carries signals from the mid-thoracic and lower parts of the body. Basically, below T6, it composes the entire posterior column. It consists of first-order nerve fibers that travel up the ipsilateral side of the spinal cord. So they stay on the same side of the spinal cord and travel up to the medulla oblongata, where it terminates in the gracile nucleus. This pathway carries signals for vibration, visceral pain, deep and discriminative touch, and then proprioception from the lower limbs and lower trunk. Remember, proprioception is a non-visual sense of the position and movements of your body. It's an awareness of where your arm is in space, even though you can't see your arm. Now, the cuneate fasciculus joins the gracile fasciculus at about thoracic vertebrae 6. It occupies the lateral portion of the posterior column here. It carries the same type of sensory signals, but those originating at level T6 and up, so for the upper limb and chest. The fibers end in the cuneate nucleus on the ipsilateral side of the medulla oblongata, so they travel in the same way that the Gracile Fasciculus neurons travel. The medial lemniscus is formed from the second-order neurons of the gracile and cuneate systems. They then decussate in the medulla oblongata, as in they switch to the other side. The tracts of these nerve fibers lead the rest of the way up to the thalamus. The third-order neurons from both the gracile and cuneate fasciculi go from the thalamus to the cerebral cortex. So information traveling up both of these pathways is carried to the contralateral cerebral hemisphere from where the sensory information originated. Here's a different example. The Spinothalamic Pathway is one of the smaller tracts in the anterolateral system, as in on the anterior lateral side. It carries signals about pain, pressure, temperature, light touch, tickle, and itch. Their first-order neurons end in the posterior horn of the spinal cord. Here, they synapse with second-order neurons, which immediately decussate to the other side of the spinal cord. And then they form the ascending tract of the Spinothalamic Tract. And then they form the ascending Spinothalamic Tract. The third-order neurons continue from the thalamus up into the cerebral cortex. The Spinoreticular Tract also travels up the anterolateral system. It carries pain signals that result from tissue injury. The first-order neurons enter the posterior horn and immediately synapse with second-order neurons, just like we saw in the Spinothalamic Tract. They decussate to the opposite anterolateral system and then ascend the cord and end in a loosely organized core of gray matter, which we will know as the reticular formation in the medulla and pons. The third-order neurons then go from the pons to the thalamus, and then there's a fourth-order neuron that completes the path to the cerebral cortex. So the reticular tract is slightly different. We'll spend more time on that in a future chapter. Now, the Spinocerebellar Tracts travel through the lateral column. They carry proprioceptive signals from the limbs and the trunk to the cerebellum, which is a large motor control area at the rear of the brain. The first-order neurons of the system originate in the muscles and the tendons and end in the posterior horn. Very similar to the other tracts. You can see the common themes here. The second-order neurons will then send their fibers up the spinocerebellar tracts and end in the cerebellum. Fibers of the posterior tract travel up the ipsilateral side of the spinal cord. The fibers on the anterior tract cross over and travel up the contralateral side. So some fibers travel ipsilaterally and some fibers travel contralaterally. That is, they cross back in the brainstem to enter the ipsilateral side of the cerebellum. All this information provides the cerebellum with feedback that's needed to coordinate the muscle actions. So again, here's a number of different examples of ascending tracts or fasciculi. Don't get too wrapped up in memorizing precisely where things cross over. Do remember these details about the ascending tracts, that there are predominantly 3 orders of neurons, and what happens with each of them. Remember, there are variations on where information decussates, whether it moves contralaterally or ipsilaterally. But you don't need to know exactly where things cross over. We'll also see a number of descending tracts. Descending tracts carry motor signals down the brainstem and spinal cord. So they involve 2 different motor neurons, the upper motor neuron and the lower motor neuron. These originate in the cerebral cortex or the brainstem, and they'll terminate on the lower motor neuron. The lower motor neuron is in the brainstem or spinal cord, and the axon of the lower motor neuron leads the rest of the way to the muscle or other target organ. So that is, if you need to move the muscles of your toes, that lower motor neuron may begin all the way up in your brainstem and descend the spinal cord all the way down your leg into the muscles that operate the toes. That is one big long cell. Again, what do you really need to know? The differences between ascending and descending tracts in general. There were 3 neurons involved in ascending tracts, and there are only 2 involved in the descending tracts. Let's look at a couple. The corticospinal tracts lead from the cerebral cortex and allow precise, finely coordinated limb movements. The pyramids, as we'll see soon, are ridges on the surface of the medulla oblongata, and they're formed by the fibers of the corticospinal tracts. The corticospinal tracts decussate in the lower medulla and then move into the lateral corticospinal tract on the contralateral side of the spinal cord. The anterior ventral corticospinal tract will be found on the ipsilateral side of the spinal cord. Again, a 2-neuron pathway. The upper motor neuron purely in the cerebral cortex. The lower motor neuron will be found purely in the spinal cord. We'll also see a number of different tracts. Won't go into any more details at this moment, but there'll be the tectospinal tract beginning in the midbrain region, or the tectum, crossing to the contralateral side of the midbrain. This tract is primarily involved with the reflex of turning the head in response to sights and sounds. We'll also see a lateral and medial reticulospinal tract, originating in the reticular formation. You'll see these names are all named for where they originate and where they end. And the name is arranged in the direction of signal travel. The lateral and medial reticulospinal tracts control muscles of the upper and lower limbs, especially those involved in balance. Some of them contain descending analgesic pathways. That is, they reduce the transmission of pain signals to the brain to dampen our experience of pain. There's a lateral and medial vestibulospinal tract. It begins in the brainstem at the vestibular nuclei and receives impulses about balance from the organs of our inner ear. These control the extensor muscles of the limbs for balance and control. So again, there's tons of information here about the various different tracts. You're off the hook for knowing what each of these tracts do, but do understand the differences, the major differences between the ascending and descending motor tracts in the spinal column. Now, something that someone may want to present on for the end of the semester could be poliomyelitis or ALS. These are both diseases that cause destruction of the motor neurons and production of skeletal muscle atrophy because there's a lack of innervation. I'm not going to go into details here, but perhaps one of you would like to take it on. Take a moment here to diagram the differences between ascending and descending tracts. You can pick a random place for the decussation, whether it's in the spinal cord or the brainstem isn't that important, but do recognize that some signals decussate to the contralateral side and some signals don't. Include those in your diagram to help you understand the variances in these different pathways.